Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Skype sessions. Today, I am speaking to James Tauber from the Digital Tolkien Project. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I have so many things that I want to talk about and some really nerdy details I want to get into. But let's back off a little bit first of all. And would you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be involved with the world of Tolkien?
Yeah, so I mean, my initial interest in Tolkien was pretty typical. I fell in love with The Hobbit as an 11-year-old, but it started to diverge pretty quickly after that. My family all knew that I was a big fan of The Hobbit, and for my 12th birthday, my aunt bought me a copy of Return of the King, which is, of course, the third part of Lord of the Rings, and I knew that it was the third part. I knew I couldn't dive right into it without going back to the Fellowship of the Ring. But I saw that there were these appendices at the back. And I started reading about this history of the First and Second Age. I started looking at timelines. I started reading about languages. And soon my interest in actually going back and reading Fellowship of the Ring waned, at least in comparison to my desire to know more about this history and these timelines and these languages and so on. And so the next Tolkien related book that I ended up acquiring, I don't remember the details, it was a long time ago, but at age 12, 13, it would have been, I got a hold of Robert Foster's book, The Complete Guide to Middle Earth. And so my entry into the Legendarium was primarily encyclopedic rather than narrative. And I just became obsessed with knowing more about the world. And I started trying to read the Silmarillion. The fact that it had been described to me as difficult even for adults was a wonderful
Challenge?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a great way to motivate a early teenage
This is
boy
probably
to
too
read a
difficult
book.
for you. You probably wouldn't like this.
Exactly. And they were right. I struggled with it, and but I did become obsessed with the Ainulindale, the first chapter, the creation myth, and I was interested in music at the time, and so I had all these grand ideas to portray the music of the Ainulindale. The Tolkien's creation myth is very musically based. And I wanted to know more about this. Where can I get more information about the Ainulindale? And then I found out that Tolkien's son, Christopher, had been publishing earlier versions and drafts and so on of Tolkien's works. And so I got hold of volume 4 of the History of Middle Earth, which had more descriptions of the creation myth and so on. And so I was diving deep into the History of Middle Earth. I had not read Lord of the Rings at this point yet. But that was sort of, that planted a whole lot of different seeds in me. And to cut a long story short, when I went to university, I actually started off initially as a mathematics major, but then I fell in love with linguistics and got really interested in the whole idea of studying language scientifically and using computers. I was into computers as well, into using computers to better understand languages. And a lot of the languages I was interested in, well, the main language I was interested in was actually New Testament Greek. And unlike a lot of linguists who get to go out and talk to native speakers, if they're studying some indigenous language or something, they can interview speakers of that language to find out more. In my case, all I had was the texts, right? So I had to use computers to better understand what was going on with the Greek New Testament and other texts as well. I became interested in looking at Dante in the Italian and a bunch of stuff like that. But as I started to study more and more linguistics, I started coming across these terms that I remembered I'd read in the Lord of the Rings appendices. Appendix E, when he's describing the sounds of Elvish, he uses all these terms, and I was hearing these terms in my linguistics lectures, and it was just this wonderful realization that the seeds had been planted in me to study linguistics by reading the appendices of Lord of the Rings as a 12-year-old. So I continued working with texts, and to this day, it's my day job is writing software to help scholars understand texts, primarily ancient Greek, but also Latin and Old English and Old Norse and a bunch of stuff like that. But then the realization happened, and this is sort of leading into how the Digital Tolkien Project came about. One of the things that I'd always observed talking to other people, particularly academics with an interest in Tolkien, was that Tolkien resonated with them in a way that no author did in relation to their scholarly pursuits. I would talk to theologians who would say, Tolkien reminds me of this. Biblical scholars that would say, reading the Silmarillion is like reading the Old Testament, and I would talk to classicists who would say it's like reading Homer, and so there were all these people, experts in their fields, that would associate Tolkien with their objects of study, often texts, ancient texts. And I thought, well, hang on a sec. I love Tolkien. I work with scholars on writing computer software to better understand texts. Why don't I apply all that to the texts of Tolkien if there's such an interest? And I think it's true, the texts of Tolkien, more than any other author in the last couple of hundred years, get studied to a level of detail that's only equaled by much older texts. And so that sort of sparked the creation of the Digital Tolkien Project, which is trying to apply the same sorts of ideas of what gets done with Homer and the Old Testament and so on, and apply those to the works of Tolkien.
Now, I've interviewed a lot of people and asked them for their Inklings origin story. I think that one has got to be the weirdest. Going to the appendices first and diving deep into Middle Earth, and still haven't actually read the story. You have read The Lord of the Rings now,
yes? So when the Peter Jackson movies came out, I thought I really should read the books first. And so it was actually, even though I'd read The Hobbit in the 80s, I ended up reading Lord of the Rings in the early 2000s in preparation for the Peter Jackson films.
And what was that experience like? What was it like reading about a land and a culture and cultures that you had studied so deeply, and then suddenly to find a story set in them? What is that experience like? Because I think you're the only person that's done it that way.
I certainly don't recommend it necessarily, but it's funny because I have no comprehension of what the opposite must have been like, especially for people who read Lord of the Rings between 1954 and 1977 when the Silmarillion came out. I've spoken to a few people in that situation, what it must have been like to just get these glimpses of things and not have them explained. I mean, it's remarkable. And I think a big part of the depth of Lord of the Rings is that there are so many subtle references to the legendarium that never get explained within the text of Lord of the Rings. And the brilliance of it is they're not just there to add depth. They are actually
true references,
deep work that had existed for decades before, in some cases 40 years before Lord of the Rings came out. And so you get these strange references when Frodo and the other hobbits meet Gildor in the Woody End. And he makes references to the elves traveling west and being exiled and all this. And there's no explanation of what do you mean they're exiled? Why are they traveling west? All of that sort of stuff. And whereas I immediately knew, they must be Noldor that had come over to get the Silmarils and so on. So some of that was, I appreciated it immediately because I knew the references, which was wonderful. But I meant I completely missed that mystery and that excitement when you finally got to reading the Silmarillion after reading Lord of the Rings, and all of a sudden things being explained. So, yeah, I don't recommend it necessarily as a reading order for people, but it was what ended up happening to me. Yeah.
Mm. Well, in the Digital Tolkien Project, there are a number of sub-projects. What actually is it that you're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, it's really a huge umbrella project, and it's something that I imagine I'll be doing for the rest of my life. A lot of what's involved in any kind of text project starts off just with having a good digital text. And that can be acquired a number of different ways from, you have obviously ebooks and so on, but they typically have some kind of digital rights management protection on them. You can scan books and OCR them, which is not always precise and needs to be corrected. But once you have a text, and there's a lot of questions around what edition to use and exactly how you sort of deal with that sort of thing as well. But then there's a lot of things that you can do on top of that. One of the big things with any kind of in copyright text is because you can't just share the text with other people. If you do start annotating it and you make certain, to pick an example, one of the things that you often want to do with a text, a narrative text that's got direct speech, is you want to clearly mark out who's speaking at every point, because then you can extract the speech of a different person and do analysis. If you're interested in, do elves speak differently from hobbits? Does Frodo speak differently from Sam? Does Frodo's language change throughout the course of the Lord of the Rings and so on? Those kinds of questions as a starting point need you to have annotated the text with who the speaker is. But because, say, somebody else does that, and they want to share that analysis, that annotation with me, so I can do some more analytical work, they can't just give me a marked up text because the text is in copyright. And so there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done using what's called standoff annotation, where instead of putting the annotation in the text itself, you reference offsets into the text. You say things like, oh, okay, the 10th through 15th word of the third paragraph in chapter 7 is Frodo speaking. And so in order to do that, you have to have some sort of referencing scheme, some sort of agreed upon definition of what the chapters are, what the paragraphs are, and so on. And so a lot of the initial work, still ongoing with the Digital Tolkien Project, has just been establishing these sort of referencing schemes, these citation schemes for the different books. So that now exists for The Hobbit, for Lord of the Rings, for the Silmarillion, and we just finished what was by far the most difficult, the Unfinished Tales, which were particularly difficult because it's the first of the books that we've really tackled deeply that has a lot of commentary, notes, and so on from Christopher Tolkien. And it's a good setup to tackle History of Middle Earth, which we've done a little bit of work on, but not fully done. Another side effect of having that kind of referencing system established for the books, especially things like Unfinished Tales, and will help with subsequent books as well, is we can easily extract what parts were written, what parts are Christopher speaking versus what parts are manuscripts of his father's, which is important for even simple things like search, right? If you open up Unfinished Tales in a Kindle and you search for a word, there's no way in the Kindle search that you can say, I want to find where this word is used in a manuscript from J.R.R. Tolkien, as opposed to in Christopher's notes or commentary. But we're now able to do that sort of thing because we have clearly delineated what parts of the text are coming from manuscripts, what parts are coming from the commentary from Christopher. And there's all sorts of things. I mean, just continuing to riff on the manuscript stuff, we can then start to, and this is something we're hoping to do soon, tie those manuscript quotations to the actual archives. So Tolkien's manuscripts at the Marquette at Marquette University at the Tolkien Archive there, or the Bodleian Library at Oxford has the non-Lord of the Rings manuscripts, and so we're able to say, okay, where does this actually? How do we tie this particular quotation of a manuscript that Christopher's using to an actual manuscript in the archives that scholars can potentially go and see for themselves in the archives.
So you're basically developing like an apparatus that you would use for, say, biblical commentary, where at the bottom it's giving you the textual variations, which manuscripts they're found in, all of this sort of stuff.
Exactly, and you're absolutely right. If we use the biblical analogy, it's so true, right? We've got first of all, we've got chapters and verses, right? That's something that was obviously layered upon the biblical texts, but it's crucial to any kind of commentaries or anything, right? You almost can't imagine a commentary without a chapter and verse system. But once you have that, you can tie commentaries to that. You can do that sort of text criticism with the textual variants. I've done work on textual variations in the printed Silmarillion, which is it was very interesting, almost accidental project. I had 2 electronic copies of the Silmarillion that I had produced, one from the ebook and one from a OCR, optical character recognition scan of a first edition of the Silmarillion. So I had a 1977 book that had been chopped up. I've actually got it right, happen to have it right in front of me. So it's quite sad. I've got this book where I've got individual pages of the Silmarillion because you have to guillotine it to put it in the document reader. Fortunately, first edition Silmarillions are not rare. I could not do that for for a Hobbit, for example, which would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the Silmarillion was actually, I found out recently, the Silmarillion was by some ways of counting this, the biggest selling book in 1977, which is remarkable. If I ask you which of Tolkien's works was the number one selling book in the year it was released, the answer is the Silmarillion in 1977. I suspect a lot of people bought it but didn't get through it.
Well,
but anyway,
they had questions and they weren't quite ready to scour through that to find the answers.
Exactly. But anyway, so I had the first edition Silmarillion scanned and ebook, and my objective was actually just to compare the two as a way of correcting any mistakes. Right? If you have two independent texts, and you compare them and look at the differences, then you can go back to the original whenever you do have a difference to see, what's it supposed to be. It's a good way of catching errors. And as I did that, I discovered 40 places where the ebook differed from the first edition, and that weren't just mistakes in the OCR or something like that. And led to an interesting adventures in the kind of textual history of the Silmarillion that I was not expecting. And when certain things got corrected, there were mistakes in the Silmarillion that got corrected in the paperbacks in the 80s, but weren't corrected in the hardcovers until the 2000s, and all sorts of fun stuff like that. So that was another little sort of unexpected side project to all this. But there's a lot of stuff we're now doing as we're kind of layering more and more annotations on top of things. We're doing a lot more linguistic analysis that can be combined with things like the speaker identification annotation to answer questions about, where a particular adjective's used by different speakers or of different characters and so on. So there's a lot we're starting to do now with that sort of more linguistic analysis, building on top of the foundation of all the other stuff that we're doing.
In my current reading of The Lord of the Rings, one thing I'm noticing more than other times when I've gone through it is how the speech of the hobbits changes depending upon who they're talking to. There seems to be a real shift,
Yes.
A real adaptation when they're talking to elves or men or themselves.
Absolutely.
There seems to be a real shift. I'd never noticed it before, but I imagine you would be able to actually do that programmatically, computationally.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really the goal, to sort of take observations and verify them against the entire text and look for sort of capturing all of those patterns. And obviously, in order to do that, you need to know not only who the speaker is, but who they're speaking to. And so, there's what often happens is you get these interesting research questions that require you to have done a certain annotation on the text. And so you go away and do that annotation on the text. And then having that annotation of the text inspires new questions and so on. So that's why I imagine I'll be doing this for quite a long time.
Now, one question that jumps into my head as soon as I saw the existence of this thing is, how is he navigating the copyright issues with the Tolkien estate? And I mentioned it to you before we started. I'm not hiding my hand here. I'm looking down the corridor of time, and I'm looking at a point in the future when Lewis's stuff will be more readily available and out of copyright. And I've seen what the Chesterton Society have started doing with Chesterton's works, and I'm seeing what you're doing with Tolkien, and I'm really just I'm just intrigued how you're navigating all of those things now, and if it's likely to change in the future.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it would completely change if the works were out of copyright, and there's a couple of Tolkien works that are. For example, his philological review in the year in English studies is now out of copyright, and I've digitized it and made it available. So there's a few things to keep in mind. I've already mentioned this sort of use of standoff annotations, where you don't exchange the text, you only exchange the annotations with references. But there's other things you need to be careful of around making sure that anything you publish in terms of the results and analysis cannot be used to reconstruct the text. That's sort of one of the tests. So one example of something that I can't do is so one of the analyses that I've done is something called n-grams, which is where you basically n stands for some number. So it could be 5 grams, it could be 10 grams, it could be 2 grams. The idea is that a 2 gram is just a sequence of 2 words in a row. A 5 gram is a sequence of 5 words in a row. And so you can compile together a list of all of the 5 grams, say, in the text. And the way you do that is you take the first 5 words, and that's the first 5 gram. Then you take the second through 6th word, and that's the second 5 gram, the third through 7th word, and so on. And I actually recently gave a talk at the Mythmoot conference that partly involved finding all of the 5 grams and 7 grams and so on in the different works. One of the reasons for doing that is being able to see where text has been reused in one place to another. If you can identify, obviously, a single word being reused is not meaningful. The fact that "the" appears all over the place is not meaningful. The fact that Frodo appears all over the place is not particularly meaningful. But if you start to get sequences of 5 words or 7 words or 20 words in a row, then you can do some interesting studies of text reuse. You can look at exactly where one work or part of a work is quoting another work or alluding to it in some way using similar phrasing and so on. There's a lot you can do with that. But I'm not able to publish the list of 5 grams because once you have, it's exactly the same with the DNA sequencing works, right? If you have enough overlapping, even though the strings are very short, if you have enough of them overlapping, you can reconstruct the full text from that, and so that's a no-no. Even things like one of the things that I recently built is Search Tolkien, and it's a search engine for Tolkien that spans. It does a couple of things that weren't possible before. One, it returns results in terms of the referencing schemes, so it's a really good way if you're not sure. I can't work out what paragraph number this is. Just tell me what reference to use. You can start typing in the paragraph, and it will tell you what the proper reference to use for it is. But the other thing it does is it spans all of the works, at least the ones we've indexed so far. So it has The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, and the letters. And so you can search for a word or search for terms, multiple word terms, and it will tell you all the places that appears. And over time, I'll give some more statistics and so on. But I never show I wish I could, but I never show the results in context. Because again, you could use that to reconstruct the text. If you search for, in, you'll get the beginning of The Hobbit, and it will tell you, the next, whatever the context it's showing is 10 words, say, and then you could go search for the last of those and find where, get the context for that, and so on, and reconstruct it. So you always have to be mindful of not allowing anyone to be able to reconstruct the text from the results or the analysis, the annotations that you're publishing. I have spoken. Yeah,
I had once heard that you could reconstruct at least the New Testament from the quotations given within the early Church Fathers, and much like your idea of being able to reconstitute the text from your search results. Honestly, I think if somebody's going to try and reconstitute the text that way, they have earned it. They have paid in blood, sweat, and tears. Just let them have it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the funny thing is, I cannot imagine somebody doing something like that doesn't already own 10 copies of the text, right? I mean, and so I have had conversations with the estate and through them with HarperCollins. And I'm hopeful that there are certain things that we'll be able to work out together. It's been important to me right from the outset not to do anything to
anger them,
violate their rights or upset them in any way. And in fact, one of my motivations, because there are people out there that, I mean, you can download illegal digitizations of the text. And I would rather stop. I would rather have a legitimate estate and publisher endorsed approach to doing this, rather than have people have to just use illegal copies. I mean, a lot of scholars are forced to, in a way. Right? If anyone's wanting to do any kind of computational analysis of the text, there aren't many legal ways of doing it. Certainly in a way that lets scholars share the effort, share the work, and that's something that I'm really hoping still within the rights of the estate and the publisher, because in a lot of cases that it's the publisher, it's not just the estate. The publisher has the ultimate rights of a lot of the text. Just to do it in a way that keeps things within their rights and their desires, but enables scholars to do new things with the text and suitably motivated enthusiasts and so on. I don't want to just say scholars, because one of the wonderful things about the Tolkien community is just the extent to which it blurs the line between actual professional scholars and fans who just want to go deep into the text.
Yeah. Well, if somebody wanted to do a similar project, let's say, for example, C.S. Lewis, how would you recommend they begin? And also, what kind of tools would people be looking at here? I work in IT, so I'm already looking at things like Elasticsearch and various annotation pieces of software. So how would you recommend beginning?
Yeah, so I mean, the acquisition of a digital text and sort of correction of any errors and stuff like that is fundamental. The acquisition of the text is still fraught with some difficulty in terms of what you are and aren't allowed to do. I'm not completely clear what the situation is in most countries. There was a recent ruling by the US Copyright Office that the DRM protection on ebooks could be cracked purely for the purposes of text analysis, scholarly text analysis, which was a hugely important ruling because it means that it's actually possible in the US anyway to take ebooks and use those as the basis for text mining and so on. You can't redistribute the text, to be clear. Right? That's still very clearly a violation of copyright. But the DRM protection on ebooks is not a copyright thing anyway. It's a separate DMCA law, and it was weird. The situation's kind of weird. I think this is true in Britain as well. That even if you have permission from the copyright holder, it's still illegal. It was still illegal to crack the DRM on an ebook. Even if the publisher said they were okay with it, it wasn't up to the publisher. It was still a federal crime in the US. But the US Copyright Office has made a ruling in October last year that said that for text mining analysis purposes, you could do it. So, and keying in. I mean, another thing is keying in the text, manually typing it in. I know some scholars that have done that with texts. That's a huge effort. I mean, it's how we got a lot of the ancient Greek texts that I work with came in that way originally, paying people to just type in the Greek text, or OCRing, optical character recognition is a big way of doing that. Even before the actual text preparation, there's just having a good sense of sort of the bibliographic data. What are the texts you want? What versions of those texts? How are you where are you going to get those texts from, and so on. That's probably the first important step, is to be clear about what the priorities are for the texts you want to do, and do you care about different editions? Do you care about that sort of level of detail? Because for some research questions, it's incredibly important which edition you're dealing with. In other cases, not so much. And then in terms of, once you have that text, there's a lot you could do. Again, you have to do it locally. You can't share it with people. But there are a lot of emerging text analysis tools. I tend to write my own just because it's my day job. I mean, my day job is writing those tools. You mentioned Elasticsearch for just sort of general search stuff, but there's a lot of things you could do. There's a lot of natural language processing libraries now that will, for example, annotate the text with part of speech information. So, go through and mark all the nouns and the verbs and adjectives and so on, which is important for a lot of questions that you might want to ask. The state of the art of that sort of technology is probably in the high 90%. So you still need, maybe 97% of the time it'll get it right. You still need to go through and correct it. So that's another big task to do. But then you can ask really interesting questions about, what's the, what different parts of speech are used when. And one of the things that I looked at last year was I plotted through did this on The Hobbit, plotted where in The Hobbit there were first or second pronouns used outside of direct speech. So where were words like you and I and me used that were not in direct speech? And my reasoning was that would give a good indication of where the narrator was intruding. I also looked at present tense verbs outside of direct speech, again for the same reason that when Tolkien in The Hobbit, he'll often step in and make a comment. You can almost hear him telling his kids as he's telling them this story that, don't worry, we're going to find out what happened to Bilbo. But that's always characterized by first or second person pronouns and present tense verbs outside of the direct speech. So annotating the text that way with natural language processing tools was a step towards that. Another thing, another project that we're doing at Digital Tolkien Project, another sub-project that's might be relevant to any text that you do, is going through and annotating all of the people, places, all the names, basically. First of all, identifying where they are in the text, but then also tying those names to the underlying entities that they're referring to. So if you have characters, particularly that have multiple names or
Thanks,
referred
Tolkien.
to in different ways. Yeah, exactly. So, for example, I mean, a really good example is Aragorn in Lord of the Rings goes by, off the top of my head, I think there's 119 or something different terms that are used of him. Predominantly Aragorn or Strider. But even just the Aragorn Strider distinction, right? If you're wanting to do a search for where Aragorn is mentioned, not the word Aragorn, the person Aragorn, then you need to know that he's also called Strider, that he might be called the heir of Isildur, that he might also be called Elisar. There's also, so knowing all of that kind of information is and annotating the text with that kind of information is another thing that you can do. So there's a really interesting combination of stuff that you can mostly automate with tools and stuff that's just very, very slow, methodical annotation of text. And
but it basically gives you this ontology that you can then do meta queries about everything, because you not only know what's written in the text, but you know what it means.
Exactly. And that's why the referencing schemes become so important. We're going to be publishing our information, and we're going to be able to do it in a way that, because we've got like the paragraph numbers, we can at least do and say, well, when this term is used in this paragraph, it's referring to this person. It's not just about people with multiple names. It's also multiple names that could refer to different people. Right? Tolkien did have a habit of reusing names, and so disambiguating who's referred to. It's like Mary in the New Testament, could refer to quite a few different people, right? So going through and saying, oh, this is Mary Magdalene, oh, this is Mary, Jesus' mother, and so on. The same process can be taken with the names in Tolkien as well, and C.S. Lewis, of course.
Exactly. Well, I have a plan now, so thank you for that. As we wrap up, can you just tell people where they can go to find out more about the Digital Tolkien Project? Any particular help that you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So the place to start is digitaltolkien.com as the website. I'm also Digital Tolkien on Twitter and Instagram, but all of that's mentioned on digitaltolkien.com. The search engine that I mentioned, the Search Tolkien, is available at search.digitaltolkien.com. But all of the information about what we're doing and so on is there. The goal is, to the extent that we can make information publicly available, that we will do so for download. And for those of you who are familiar with GitHub, we're putting stuff on GitHub wherever possible. I mean, in terms of ways of helping, there's so much that we can do in terms of annotation. And if people are interested in being part of that slow, laborious process of going through the text and annotating in certain ways, definitely get in contact with me. It has to be something, I think, that you yourself are motivated to do, independent of just showing up and saying, hey, give me a task to do, because unless you have some intrinsic motivation yourself, I think it can be a real slog. But if you are interested in some specific aspect of the text that involves sort of large scale annotation, then please do get in touch, and we can work together to make sure that you can produce those annotations in a way that sort of links to our base text and will enable other people to really take advantage of the work that you do. Because at the end of the day, that's one of the primary things I'm trying to facilitate is collaboration on these annotations and texts. And the fact that it's still in copyright poses challenges for that, but not insurmountable. There are ways of making sure that we can work together and share the results of our labors.
Wonderful. Well, James, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
I'm sure our paths will cross again.
I hope so.
Viewers, please join us next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.